a distant, mysterious island, eclipsed in folklore and superstition. A land which sits on the very edge of the world, home to a ferocious tide, ancient people and dense forests. 8,000 miles away, the Senate eagerly awaits news as Julius Caesar is about to disembark from his ships. Along with legions of well-seasoned Roman soldiers, all armed to the teeth with gladius, lorica hamata, scutum and pilum. The shores of which the Roman war machine is stepping onto. Albion. However, once the Roman army has successfully conquered this land, it would be renamed, its new name, Britannia. The general consensus is that the Iron Age began in Britain in around 800 BC. During this time, the British Isles was a very rural and sparsely populated area. There was no primary ruling faction, but instead there were multiple tribal kings who owned small portions of territory. Some were allied to others, some were at war. Mostly over border disputes and the ownership of prosperous resources, such as malachite and tin mines, two of the main ingredients used to make bronze and copper. The term tribal gives us connotations that these were a simplistic and primal people, however this was far from true. They primarily lived in round houses made from timber, thatch, wattle and daub. These ranged from small one-person dwellings to large family-sized homes, complete with a central hearth. While some communities were based out in open countryside, others were protected by large circular earthworks, featuring steep concentric ditches and tall palisade walls. These Iron Age tribes would often trade locally, but they also knew how to navigate the harsh seas, which had a particular reputation for being dangerous, especially compared to the relatively calm waters of the Mediterranean. These Britannic traders would export tin from modern-day Cornwall, and malachite, the ore required for copper, from deep mine networks such as the Great Orme, located in Llandudno, northern Wales. In return, they would import many goods such as wine and gold from Gaul, which is modern-day France, and quernstones made from igneous rock in Germany. Beads made from amber and glass were imported from Central Europe and the Mediterranean, some of which also locally found in Britain. Goods such as these were highly sought-after commodities, and showed great wealth and stature to those who could afford it. By the middle of the 1st century BC, the Roman Empire began to spread across Europe, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. So many of these trade networks were taken over by a new regime. Despite this, it is thought that trade between the British tribes and mainland Europe continued relatively stable, as Britain was a faraway island on the corner of the map and did not seem to pose any threat to the Romans. By around 55 BC, Julius Caesar had recently completed a remarkably dramatic campaign through Gaul, adding many more territories under the rule of the Roman Empire. Before the end of his conquest, he navigated a portion of coastline around the British Isles. By late summer, Caesar had amassed his legions at Icius Portus, a Roman port in what would now be called Calais in northern France. His force consisted of around 80 transport ships for the 7th and 10th legions, as well as a further 18 transports for cavalry, which would be accompanied by warships such as briremes and triremes. It is not known why, but Caesar decided to set sail for Britain without his cavalry, possibly expecting them to join the infantry once they had established a foothold on the coastline. The fleet of ships disembarked from Calais under the veil of night, planning to arrive on the British shore by dawn. The initial landing was delayed due to the Roman ships being met with the white cliffs of the southern British coast, on which an army of Britons were already waiting for them. Due to this, Caesar anchored his ships and called for a war council to discuss his options. During this time, more and more Britons arrived to join the large army that was waiting for the Roman invaders. Spearmen, archers, slingers, cavalry and chariots had all joined the defensive force, and were now a formidable opponent. Meanwhile, the Roman commanders aboard the warship that was hosting the war council had all agreed to lift anchor and sail further up coast where an open beach had been scouted, possibly at Ebbsfleet near Ramsgate. It is documented that the Roman transport ships were clearly overloaded as they were too low in the water to get properly beached for an easy disembarkment. Instead, the ships had to anchor in relatively deep water, and the fully armoured soldiers, weighed down with their lorica squamata, scutum, gladius, helmets and spears, had to wade through the waters to reach the beach, all while being under constant bombardment from the Britannic slingers, archers and javelineers who had now opened fire. This made the Roman military very wary to disembark. It is written that a standard bearer jumped out of a ship into the water, immediately beginning to wade towards the shore. The Romans believed that it was a great sign of humiliation for a legion standard to fall in combat, so this is said to be the encouragement that the army needed to summon the will to disembark and engage in battle. After further delays, the Roman army finally managed to organise a strong defensive force on the beachhead, and repelled multiple attacks from the Britons as they marched further inland. Caesar set up camp on the coast and began initiating talks with the ambassadors from various tribes, discussing terms to prevent further immediate hostilities. Many warlords agreed to disband their armies, as it is important to remember that not all Britannic tribes were as anti-Roman as others, usually due to the trade rights they had personally established within their tribe. Despite this, the Britons were continuing to harass the legions, carrying out skirmishes on foraging parties and chasing away cavalry contingents. The renewed hostilities proved so troublesome that Caesar concluded that wintering in Britain was not a viable option, and so made the decision to uproot his legions and retreat back to the ships. Unfortunately for the Romans, their poor knowledge of British tidal behaviour revealed itself as fast and violent tides had battered the anchored fleet, causing ships to plough into each other along the mile stretch of Pegwell Bay, with some ships taking on too much water and sinking, or becoming so damaged that they were no longer seaworthy. As winter approached, the Roman army was becoming relentlessly harassed by skirmishing tribes who were demonstrating that Britain as a whole wanted nothing to do with Roman occupation, so using the wrecked transport ships as material to repair the surviving seaworthy ships, the Roman army finally boarded and set sail back to Gaul, confirming the end of the first invasion of Britannia. A second invasion a year later, in 54 BC, laid witness to some 800 ships which were holding 5 legions, and around 2,000 cavalry, all of which were being offloaded along the shore of southern Britain. The renewed plans caused a tremor of anticipation throughout the Roman Empire, with ships arriving from all over the continent to provide food and supplies to the war effort, as well as multiple merchant ships anchored along the coastline of northern Gaul, probably with the hopes to profit from the newfound trading opportunities that may present themselves in the wake of this new attempt at domination. It is unknown whether the 800 ships that Caesar quoted was including these additional cargo and merchant boats. But considering the previous invasion witnessed a fleet of a mere 80 ships taking up over a mile of beachhead, it is unlikely that if the number of 800 ships is accurate, a fair share of these were not being used for military purposes. Again, the Roman sailors found the violent currents of the English Channel particularly difficult to navigate through, so the fleet was pushed off course and hence delayed the invasion by a few hours. The ships arrived at the same beach as before, and anchored in much shallower water this time, allowing for a much more orderly disembarkment. Upon witnessing the sea completely filled with Roman military ships, the local Britons decided not to engage, as this time they were heavily outnumbered. Instead, they opted to move inland and await to mass a larger defensive force. As soon as Julius Caesar established a foothold on the shore, he ordered his army to advance on the retreating Britannic horde, hoping for an early engagement and victory to send a message to the other indigenous tribes. 2 large skirmishes followed that day, one at the river crossing possibly along the River Stour, and the other at the Britannic fortification further inland, which may have been Bigbury Wood Hill Fort. Both engagements, the Romans were victorious. With the initial Briton army defeated and scattered, and the day drawing to a close, Caesar decided to return back to base camp on the shore to meet the rest of his legions. Upon his return, he was given news that once again his ships had been battered by the harsh tides of the British Isles, with Caesar quoting that around 50 of his transport ships had been destroyed by the sea all in one evening. The next morning, Caesar recalled the legions that he had sent out and prioritised the repairing of his fleet, cautious that a simple mistake such as neglecting his damaged ships could spell doom for his legions if a massive horde of Britannic warriors were to descend from the hills at any time. Julius Caesar then embarked on his first official advance inland, traversing north up to the Thames River. During their journey northwards, the legions were constantly harassed by a combination of Britannic forces under the control of Cassivellaunus, who carried out guerrilla tactics to slow the Roman advance. He deployed thousands of light chariots, each consisting of a driver and archer, sending volleys of arrows, rocks and javelins into the Roman forces, to which the Roman army had no immediate counter. Upon arriving at the River Thames, the Romans were met with miles of sharpened stakes planted into the muddy banks of the river, making the river crossing seemingly impossible. It is uncertain what followed next, and how Caesar's army finally did cross the River Thames, but we do know that he established a military camp at East Tilbury, near the mouth of the Thames estuary, and there was no confirmation that any other immediate conflict in this area occurred. Regardless, the Roman army was now entering the territory of the Trinovantes, of which Caesar himself described as clearly one of the most powerful tribes he had come across so far in Britannia. There was much diplomacy on each side, with the Trinovantes urging the other neighbouring tribes to join forces, and the Romans also discussing the surrender and assistance of various local tribes now that the Roman army had established themselves as a powerful and elite fighting force in Britannia. The Roman army engaged the Trinovantes on multiple occasions between Hertfordshire and Kent, and had so far been successful in keeping this powerful tribe at bay. However, it was now September. The winter was drawing near once again. Caesar was now well aware that navigating the English Channel in winter was treacherous, so he was forced to cut his military campaign short. He ordered his legions to march back south, without leaving any garrison to defend his conquered foothold in Britain. Before Caesar left Britain, he managed to extract tribute from some of the local warlords in exchange for protection, and set up a new leader of the Trinovantes tribe to be the client king in Britannia for Rome. After this, the Roman army then retreated back to their ships and sailed back to Gaul. It is often disputed as to the purpose of Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain, and what his intentions were. Some believe that it was a hurried campaign which assumed there would not be much contestment to the Roman war machine. Others believe that it was a navigation and fact-finding mission, as Caesar learned how the indigenous people lived, the geography of the land, and most importantly, what resources were locally available. Next time, we will discuss the third invasion of Britannia, and the first time that the Romans laid eyes upon this land with the intent to conquer and occupy the entirety of the British Isles. But for now, thanks for watching.